Jack, I've noticed that learning English through stories can be both enjoyable and effective. Stories help learners remember vocabulary and grammar more naturally. What's your experience with this approach?
Absolutely, Emma. Stories engage learners emotionally, which boosts memory. When you connect words and phrases to characters and plots, you don't just memorize, you experience the language. It's like learning with context, which is much easier and more fun.
Yes, and stories also expose learners to everyday conversations and expressions in a way textbooks can't. For example, when I read a story, I naturally pick up idioms and slang used by characters.
Right, and stories also help with cultural understanding. Many expressions only make sense when you know the culture behind them. So, stories are a gateway to language and culture combined, making learning richer.
So, how would you recommend learners start using stories to improve their English? Should they read, listen, or watch stories?
All three. Reading helps with vocabulary and grammar, listening improves pronunciation and intonation, and watching brings visuals that make comprehension easier. Starting with simple, short stories is best, then gradually moving to longer or more complex ones.
I agree. For beginners, illustrated stories or children's books are great because the pictures provide clues to meaning. Plus, the language is usually simpler and repetitive, which aids memorization.
Exactly. And for intermediate learners, graded readers, stories written for language learners at different levels, offer a perfect balance. They include useful vocabulary, comprehension questions, and summaries to reinforce learning.
Listening to audiobooks or podcasts that tell stories is also effective. Learners get used to natural speed and rhythm of English speech. Plus, they can listen anytime, like during a commute or while exercising.
Yes, and combining listening with reading the transcript or book at the same time, known as extensive reading and listening, helps reinforce vocabulary and pronunciation simultaneously. It's an immersive experience.
Speaking of speaking, retelling stories is an excellent way to practice. When learners summarize or narrate stories in their own words, they practice forming sentences and using new vocabulary actively.
Definitely. It also builds confidence because retelling is less stressful than inventing a new story from scratch. Learners can start by telling simple plots and gradually add details and emotions as their skills improve.
I like that idea. It turns passive learning into active communication. Another tip is to discuss stories with friends or tutors. Talking about characters or plots helps learners use English spontaneously and think critically in the language.
Discussion also builds listening and comprehension skills, because you hear others' viewpoints. It's a dynamic way to engage with stories and practice conversational English at the same time.
What kind of stories do you think work best for English learners?
Stories with relatable themes and everyday language work best. For example, stories about friendship, travel, or daily life. They include vocabulary and situations learners are likely to encounter, which makes learning practical.
Humor is a powerful element too. Funny stories or jokes make learning enjoyable and memorable. When learners laugh, they're more relaxed and open to absorbing language naturally.
That's true. Also, stories with repeated phrases or refrains help reinforce learning through repetition. Think of classic tales like The Very Hungry Caterpillar or Goldilocks and the Three Bears, where language patterns repeat.
Have you seen learners struggle with stories? What challenges do they face?
Sometimes learners get overwhelmed by long or complex stories, especially if the vocabulary is too advanced. They might lose interest or feel frustrated. So, it's crucial to choose materials appropriate for their level and interests.
Another challenge is understanding idioms or cultural references that aren't explained in the story. Learners can feel lost if they don't get the context.
Right, which is why supplementary materials like glossaries, footnotes, or tutor explanations can be very helpful. They fill the gaps and make stories accessible without diluting the language exposure.
What advice would you give learners who want to start learning English through stories but don't know where to begin?
Start with short, simple stories and set small goals, like reading one story a day or listening to a 5-minute audiobook. Use resources designed for learners, such as graded readers or language learning podcasts with stories. Most importantly, enjoy the process.
Great advice. Should learners read stories multiple times or move on to new ones quickly?
Both have benefits. Repetition deepens understanding and reinforces vocabulary. However, exploring new stories keeps motivation high and exposes learners to diverse language. A balanced mix of review and new material works best.
Can you share a favorite story or resource that you think learners should try?
Sure. The Magic Treehouse series is fantastic for beginners and intermediate learners. The stories are engaging, vocabulary is accessible, and there's a good mix of narrative and dialogue. Plus, the audio versions are excellent for listening practice.
That sounds wonderful. I think starting with stories that capture the learner's imagination makes the journey more exciting.
Exactly, Mia. When learners are emotionally connected to stories, they're more likely to stick with their English learning and enjoy it.
Jack, I wanted to talk more about how learners can actively engage with stories to improve their English. What techniques do you recommend beyond just reading or listening?
Great point, Emma. One powerful technique is role-playing. Learners can take on characters from stories and act out dialogues or scenes. This helps practice pronunciation, intonation, and emotional expression. Plus, it turns passive learning into active speaking practice.
Role-playing sounds fun and immersive. Even practicing alone by speaking lines aloud or recording yourself can build confidence, right?
Absolutely. Recording yourself lets you hear your mistakes and track improvement. It also simulates real conversations, preparing you to think and speak in English more naturally.
Another idea is story retelling. After reading or listening, learners summarize the story in their own words. This reinforces comprehension and vocabulary recall.
Yes, and retelling can be adapted to any level. Beginners can describe the main plot simply, while advanced learners add details and personal opinions. It's also a great conversation starter in language exchanges or classrooms.
I like that. What about incorporating writing? How does writing stories or summaries help learners?
Writing encourages learners to organize their thoughts and use grammar and vocabulary actively. It's a slower, more deliberate process that deepens understanding. Creative writing, like continuing a story or writing alternate endings, also sparks imagination and engagement.
That's an excellent point. Creative writing with stories can make grammar and vocabulary learning more meaningful. How do you suggest learners find stories suitable for writing practice?
Start with simple stories they already understand. Then, use story prompts or what-if questions. For example, what if the character made a different choice, or write a letter from the character's perspective. This encourages critical thinking and language use.
How important is discussion in learning with stories? Talking about themes, characters, or morals?
Discussion is essential. It develops speaking fluency and critical thinking. When learners share their thoughts, they practice expressing opinions and using new vocabulary spontaneously. It also builds listening skills as they engage with others' ideas.
In group settings, do you recommend structured discussions or free conversations?
Both have value. Structured discussions with guided questions ensure learners practice specific language points. Free conversations encourage natural language use and creativity. Alternating between both styles provides balance.
What about using multimedia stories, like videos or interactive apps?
Multimedia engages multiple senses, which enhances learning. Videos combine visuals, audio, and context, making comprehension easier. Interactive apps with stories often include quizzes or games that reinforce vocabulary and grammar. These varied formats keep learners motivated.
Can you suggest how learners should choose stories for different skill levels?
Beginners should start with very simple, repetitive stories with pictures. Intermediate learners can handle graded readers or simplified classics. Advanced learners can challenge themselves with authentic novels, podcasts, or films. The key is to choose stories just above their current level to encourage growth without frustration.
Sometimes learners get stuck on difficult vocabulary in stories. How can they handle this without losing interest?
Guessing from context is a valuable skill. Learners should look at surrounding words, pictures, or story events to infer meaning. When unsure, noting new words to review later is better than stopping too often. Using bilingual glossaries or learner dictionaries can help too.
What role do cultural notes or explanations play in story-based learning?
They're very helpful. Stories often include idioms, traditions, or social cues that might confuse learners. Cultural notes clarify meaning and prevent misunderstandings. This deepens learners' connection with the language and culture.
How do you recommend learners track their progress when learning with stories?
Keeping a reading or listening log with notes on new vocabulary, interesting phrases, or questions helps learners reflect and review. Setting goals like finishing a story per week or learning a set number of new words keeps motivation high.
For learners who want to create their own stories in English, what tips do you have?
Start simple. Write about daily life or personal experiences. Use familiar vocabulary and grammar. Gradually experiment with new words and sentence structures. Sharing stories with friends or tutors invites feedback and makes writing more social and enjoyable.
Storytelling is a skill that builds confidence and creativity. Do you think it can also improve thinking in English?
Definitely. Crafting stories forces learners to organize thoughts, connect ideas, and express themselves logically, all in English. This trains the brain to operate in English, supporting fluent thinking and speaking.
How important is patience and persistence in story-based learning?
Very important. Some stories or vocabulary may seem challenging at first. Revisiting stories multiple times and practicing consistently is the key. Over time, learners notice improvement in comprehension, vocabulary, and confidence.
I love that encouragement. To sum up, what 3 tips would you give learners to maximize learning through stories?
First, choose stories that interest and challenge you just enough. Second, actively engage, retell, discuss, write, or role-play. Third, be patient and consistent. Enjoy the journey and celebrate progress.
Jack, I want to dive deeper into how learners can use storytelling to improve their speaking fluency. Do you have practical exercises in mind?
Certainly, Emma. One effective exercise is the story circle. Learners take turns adding sentences to a story, which encourages spontaneous speaking and creativity. It helps them think on their feet in English and practice new vocabulary in a supportive environment.
That sounds like a lot of fun. It also pushes learners to listen carefully and build on others' ideas, which is crucial for conversation skills.
Exactly. Another exercise is story mapping. Learners outline key parts of a story, the setting, characters, conflict, and resolution, then tell the story using their notes. This breaks down the task and makes speaking less intimidating.
I like the idea of breaking stories into smaller parts. It makes the process manageable and less overwhelming for learners. What about using digital tools?
Digital storytelling apps allow learners to create multimedia stories with text, images, and audio. This engages different learning styles and makes practicing English more interactive. Plus, sharing digital stories online provides authentic audiences and feedback.
Speaking of audiences, how important is it for learners to share their stories with others?
Very important. Sharing stories builds confidence and communication skills. Feedback from peers or teachers helps learners identify areas to improve and encourages motivation. It also turns solitary study into a social experience, which makes learning enjoyable.
What challenges do learners often face when trying to tell stories in English?
Common issues include limited vocabulary, grammar mistakes, and fear of speaking. Sometimes learners struggle to organize their ideas or lose track of the story. Encouraging simple language use and practicing with supportive partners helps overcome these obstacles.
How can teachers or language partners best support learners in storytelling?
They can provide prompts or questions to guide storytelling, correct gently, and celebrate progress. Offering vocabulary lists or phrase banks related to story themes empowers learners. Creating a positive, patient environment is crucial for learners to take risks and improve.
I've noticed that storytelling also improves learners' listening skills. When you listen to other stories, you pick up new expressions and pronunciation cues.
Absolutely. Storytelling is reciprocal, both telling and listening are active skills that reinforce each other. Listening to diverse stories broadens vocabulary and exposes learners to different accents and styles.
How can learners use stories to enhance their pronunciation specifically?
Repeating or shadowing parts of a story aloud improves pronunciation and intonation. Mimicking how characters speak, including emotions and emphasis, trains the mouth and ear. Recording oneself and comparing to native speakers is also helpful.
What role does cultural storytelling play in language learning?
Cultural stories introduce learners to traditions, values, and humor, deepening their connection to the language. Understanding cultural context enhances comprehension and makes language use more authentic and meaningful.
Can you recommend some classic or contemporary stories suitable for English learners?
Sure. Classics like The Little Prince and Charlotte's Web are beloved and accessible. Contemporary stories with simple language, such as Diary of a Wimpy Kid or short stories by O. Henry, also work well. Many podcasts and YouTube channels offer original stories designed for learners.
How do you suggest learners balance reading, listening, and speaking with stories for maximum benefit?
A balanced approach is best. Read a story, listen to the audio version, then practice speaking by retelling or role-playing. Writing summaries or creative responses complements these activities. This multisensory engagement reinforces language skills deeply.
How can learners track their progress and stay motivated with story-based learning?
Keeping a learning journal with notes on vocabulary, phrases, and reflections helps. Setting goals like finishing a book or telling a story weekly provides milestones. Celebrating small wins and sharing progress with others sustains motivation.
What about learners who want to create their own stories but feel unsure about their English level?
I encourage starting small, writing or telling short, simple stories about personal experiences or everyday events. Using familiar vocabulary and sentence structures reduces pressure. Gradually expanding vocabulary and experimenting with new grammar makes storytelling a rewarding challenge.
Can storytelling techniques also improve other English skills like writing or grammar?
Yes, storytelling naturally integrates grammar and writing practice. Organizing a narrative requires proper sentence structure and coherence. Creative writing fosters grammar experimentation in a meaningful context, making learning memorable and enjoyable.
Lastly, Jack, what would be your top 3 tips for learners using stories to improve their English?
First, choose stories that interest and motivate you. Second, actively engage, read, listen, speak, write, and discuss. Third, be patient and persistent. Language learning is a journey, and stories make it fun and effective.
Now that we've explored many ways stories help with learning English, Jack, let's discuss how learners can stay motivated when progress feels slow or challenging. What advice do you have?
Motivation can definitely waver, Emma. I always suggest that learners focus on enjoyment rather than perfection. Stories are perfect because they're entertaining and engaging. When you find stories that truly interest you, learning feels less like work and more like fun. That mindset keeps motivation alive.
That's a great point. Also, setting realistic, short-term goals can help. For example, finishing a chapter, mastering a set of vocabulary, or retelling a story in your own words. Achieving these small goals builds confidence.
Exactly. Celebrating small wins creates positive reinforcement. Keeping a journal to record these achievements also reminds learners how far they've come. Sometimes progress is slow, but acknowledging it helps keep spirits high.
How can learners overcome frustration when they encounter difficult vocabulary or complex storylines?
I recommend breaking down difficult stories into smaller parts. Use glossaries or notes to clarify meanings. Also, don't hesitate to listen or read the same story multiple times. Each repetition deepens understanding and boosts confidence. Patience is key.
Repetition really is powerful. Sometimes learners feel shy sharing stories in groups or with tutors. How can they build speaking confidence in storytelling?
Start small and safe. Practice retelling stories alone or with close friends before sharing in larger groups. Role-playing characters and using expressive voice can make storytelling fun and less intimidating. Over time, confidence grows with each positive experience.
What role does feedback play in improving storytelling skills?
Constructive feedback is invaluable. It helps learners recognize strengths and areas to improve. Feedback should be encouraging, focusing on progress rather than mistakes. This supportive environment fosters growth and motivation.
Do you think learners should memorize stories or focus more on understanding and expressing ideas in their own words?
Understanding and expressing in your own words is more beneficial for language development. Memorizing can be helpful for phrases or vocabulary, but true fluency comes from adapting stories creatively. This encourages thinking and speaking in English rather than rote repetition.
How can technology support learners in this storytelling journey?
Technology offers many tools: story apps, audiobooks, language exchange platforms, and recording software. Using apps with built-in vocabulary exercises or interactive stories makes practice engaging. Recording and listening to your storytelling helps track progress and refine skills.
Before we finish, could you share a success story of someone who improved their English through stories?
Certainly. I had a student who was shy and hesitant to speak. We introduced simple children's stories and gradually increased complexity. She practiced reading aloud, retelling stories, and recording herself. Over 6 months, her fluency and confidence soared. She began participating actively in conversations and even started writing her own stories. It was inspiring to see her transformation.
That's wonderful. Stories really do make language learning accessible and enjoyable. What's your final piece of advice for learners eager to use stories to improve their English?
Dive in with curiosity and joy. Don't be afraid to make mistakes or repeat stories. Engage actively by reading, listening, speaking, and writing. Build a routine that includes stories every day. Most importantly, have fun. When learning feels like play, fluency comes naturally.
Thank you, Jack. This conversation has been enlightening, and I'm sure our listeners will find stories a fun and effective way to improve their English.
Thank you, Emma. Remember, the best stories are the ones you live and tell. Keep practicing, and your English will flourish.